So again, erythropoietin stimulates erythropoiesis in bone marrow, and erythropoiesis is the process of generating new red blood cells. So erythropoiesis refers to this process of generating red blood cells. Now let's zoom in a little closer to the process, and what we notice is that it goes from stem cell to erythroblast to reticulocytes, and then we finally get our red blood cells. So what we have here is that this is from the Martini version, and it provides a little more detail. What we see here is that, okay, we have the proerythroblast, which is like a young red blood cell. And then we have these small stages. Now, I don't expect you to know these stages at day 2, 3, and 4. But notice that what's the point here is that red blood cells, it doesn't all of a sudden like, oh, you have a new red blood cell. It has to go under multiple stages of transformation. But at day 4, when you have that normal blast, something very interesting happens. The cell ejects its nucleus, ejects its DNA. So these are all erythroblasts, and then when it ejects the nucleus, then you have a reticulocyte, and then it finally becomes a mature red blood cell. So your red blood cells, they actually don't have, your mature red blood cells, they don't have a nucleus. So that's what makes it a little special. Like most cells have nuclei, but your red blood cells, they're an exception because why? They ejected their nucleus along the way. So erythroblasts, and if you remember my lectures from last semester, if you have something that's a blast, like it has the same prefix and then blast and the same prefix and site, the blast is the immature form and the site is the mature form. So again, these mature red blood cells, they are anuclear, and that term means that it's a cell without a nucleus. And the cell nucleus typically contains DNA, but remember that the DNA contains all the instructions to make a cell and all the proteins in the cell. So the thing is that your DNA also has the proteins that have the instructions that carry out cell replication. So if you eject your DNA, can your cell replicate anymore? So can this mature red blood cell without nucleus replicate? Well, they don't, because again, they ejected their nucleus. Their nucleus had all the DNA that had all the instructions on how to do the cell cycle and replicate. So the interesting, how do you make more red blood cells? You have to make them from something called stem cells. So I did cover this during the first semester, but to review, here we have, so we all started out as one cell, and somehow we ended up developing into a full adult. So how do we do this? Well, how do we grow from one cell to a fully developed human? How do we replace our lost cells? We do it via cell division. And not only cell division, but also something else called we're going to get to that. So stem cells, they do cell division, and the two main properties of stem cells I want you to know for this class series is that they have differentiation. Stem cells can develop into other specialized types of cells. So stem cells, they can regenerate stem cells and also make more stem cells, but they can also undergo a process called differentiation, where they start to specialize. So they're no longer just regenerating, generating more stem cells. They can actually start to choose specialties. So they're kind of like all of you, or like especially if you're exploratory or undeclared, you don't have a specialty yet. But the more you get into your major, the more you get into your career, you can become more and more specialized toward that career path. So differentiation is like a stem cell choosing a career path. So stem cells, they're very young cells, and can they do? They can become all of these different types of specialized cells, and this process is called differentiation. So here is like maybe, I don't know, a liver cell, a muscle cell, red blood cell, and other types of cells, a neuron here. So stem cells, especially ones what we call, well, at this level, I don't think I expect you to really know the difference between totipotent, pluripotent, multipotent, and unipotent. I think that's more for advanced classes, but so what stem cells can choose a major. So again, when they specialize, a muscle cell isn't going to do the same thing as a neuron. A neuron is not going to do the same thing as a red blood cell. So again, these are all specialized. They're no longer stem cells, and they can't do each other's specialties. So with differentiation, again, this is the way that a stem cell becomes specialized. But the thing is that just like you choose your major, stem cells choose certain genes and instructions to help them develop into specialized cells. So it's kind of like choosing the classes you need to become your major. You get the information that's relevant to your major. And the thing is that once they become fully differentiated, it's really hard for these stem cells to become other stem cells. Or actually, no, it's hard for one of these specialized cells to do the functions of another specialized cells. So a liver cell is going to not have a hard time doing the function of a neuron. A neuron is going to have a hard time doing the function of a red blood cell. And the thing is that as they become more specialized, these differentiated cells rarely divide. So with red blood cells, it's definitely an endpoint because you ejected your nucleus. But the thing is that as these cells become more specialized, they become less occupied with cell division and more preoccupied with their specialty. So how do you generate more differentiated cells if once you generate a neuron, they don't divide, or, or most neurons don't divide? There's those special ones in the olfactory bulb. But how do you generate more differentiated cells, especially red blood cells that no longer have a nucleus? Well, again, remember the two properties, differentiation and regeneration. Regeneration is how you're able to, even though you have some cells being taken out of the population by being differentiated and specialized, regeneration is how you can produce more of these cells. So in this example, we have our stem cells, and let's keep it simple and relevant. So here we have our red blood cells. But the thing is that, remember, the stem cells ejected their nucleus along their way to becoming a fully mature red blood cell. So you can't have these erythrocytes replicating. How do you generate more erythrocytes? Well, you have to do cell cycle. You have to do the cell division. And as you generate more stem cells, you generate more and more stem cells. And these new stem cells can generate more red blood cells in this example. But what happens if you lose these red blood cells? Well, since you still have the stem cells left over, what you can do is that they can undergo replication again, and they can undergo replication and regeneration again. Then they can undergo differentiation again, and you can generate more red blood cells. So this is why stem cells are very powerful, because you can regenerate more specialized cells. Okay, so then this is what we talked about. So this is another chart we see here, and what we have here are a special type of stem cells called multipotent hematopoietic stem cells, or sometimes just hematopoietic stem cell or hemocytoblast for short. And these are the stem cells, and they can generate all the cells in your blood, all the formed elements. They initially were a hematopoietic stem cell at one point. So what we have here is that they're starting to specialize, they're starting to differentiate. So there are two paths they can choose early on, and then they can differentiate and become specialized even more and more. And then they finally generate all the formed elements, so all the different types of cells in your body. And the thing is that, okay, but the important part is that these are your stem cells. This is how you're able to generate more blood cells. If you start losing red blood cells, this is how you generate more. You have your hematopoietic stem cells. Now, what we have here, we just covered how we make erythrocyte. You have the stem cells, and then they undergo differentiation, and then they eject their nucleus, and then they finally become a mature red blood cells.